I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We've been talking about the Restoration Movement and the American Restoration Movement specifically. We've tried to stress that even though there might be some who believe this, that I don't believe this is true at all, that the Church of Christ never ceased to exist throughout all from the 1st century through to the 21st century. However, this movement that we're talking about here are people who were in denominationalism who realized that they were not following God, and so tried to restore people to the Church of the New Testament. I do not know in the United States, because the churches are autonomous, just as to how many churches there would have been apart from this movement, but we kept seeing Alexander Campbell running into people, and he said, "You believe the same thing I do," but he didn't know them before. And same thing with Barton W. Stone and John Smith and Benjamin Franklin. That's not the American Benjamin Franklin, by the way. That's a different one. He's American, but he's not one of the founding fathers. But there are many different people. They came along and said, there are groups of people who believe what the Bible teaches and are following the Bible, but they don't belong to a denomination, which is their goal. That was their goal, was not to leave the Baptist church and form another church that was a denomination. And that's what we've been studying. But to stress the point that Jesus Christ said in Matthew 16, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." If Christ's death wasn't going to prevent the church from being established, I don't believe Roman Catholicism apostasy, denominational apostasy, was going to take away the church either. It was going to be much smaller, and it was not going to be well known to history at all, but we have started digging up, in England especially, records of churches that when you read the records of what the congregation did, you'd say, "Wow, that sounds a lot like what we do." And yet they were not denominational. They were just an autonomous church here and there. But because they were not affiliated with other churches, you don't get that hierarchy. That's what we're dealing with the government. They don't understand us because we're not associated with 6, 7, 8 different churches. We don't have a hierarchy structure with someone at the top or a board of directors or anything like that. And that's why we're having trouble getting them to understand who we are. But remember, this is about late 1700s, early 1800s, we're starting to read of groups of Christians, groups of people, leaving denominationalism and starting to worship apart from denominationalism, following the pattern of the Bible. Remember, Thomas and Alexander Campbell were famous for saying, "Where the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent." However, later on in their lives, at least for Alexander Campbell, he started straying away from that. And what we're going to read tonight is a departure from the New Testament pattern. We're going to find a few divisions in churches. And this is not divisions in denominations, this is divisions in local churches. And they're going to be, because Christians move from place to place, these divisions can spread. So in other words, pretend we're the East, like we are the East End Church. Pretend we had a division over instrumental music. Half the congregation was for it, half the congregation was against it. And we divided. Well, the two divisions can form new churches and continue worshiping that way. Or one or both groups could come along and say, "No, we're going to go join an existing congregation that we know is faithful, or at least that's believing what we're doing, and we'll join to them. So in other words, say we had the people who believed in instrumental music, they say, well, there's not enough of us to go start another congregation. We're going to go worship at the West End, okay? And maybe the ones who didn't believe in instrumental music, we start our own congregation. Just hypothetical. And so we have people over here who who believe in instrumental music going to West End. Does West End believe in instrumental music? No, it doesn't. So the people who were believing in instrumental music now coming over to this church and causing the same divisions. And there might be some in that church that are taken away in that, but there might be division again. And so that's how division spreads. You have groups of Christians getting together, and since division happened, you start getting fault lines develop. And if it starts in one place, it will go to another. And sometimes division didn't happen, but you just had a small group of Christians leave and go to another congregation and do the same thing over and over. That can happen today in Canada. It has happened where congregations may not have split, but there might be some disgruntled members go to another congregation and cause the same problems. And so we need to be careful of that. That's how division spreads. But the departure from the New Testament pattern really started around 1840. That's not a long time. Alexander Campbell came to America in 1807, 1808, and was starting to preach. People leave denominationalism. 1840. We're talking one generation, really. And we're starting to see departure from New Testament Christianity. And really, that should be not a surprise. Let's go to 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 to 5. Naomi, you want to get verse 3, Tammy verse 4, and Bill verse 5.
For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions.
And will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths.
But you be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry.
All right, so this is first century when Paul's teaching this. We're talking 30 years about, give or take, from the cross. And Paul's already warning about apostasy. One generation, start of apostasy. But by the time you get to the book of Revelation, which is about another 30 years from the writing of 2 Timothy, we're already seeing apostasy. There are some of those churches. We have dead churches. We have lukewarm churches. We have churches that accept false doctrine. We have churches that left their first love. So we're 2 generations away. If the gospel's not preached, it doesn't take a long time for apostasy to start. It can take 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. It could take 100 years if the teaching is relatively strong. It just takes one section of poor teaching. And the Christians that hear that poor teaching are not going to be as strong as the ones before that. It's happened in Canada. It's happened in the United States. It's happened all across the globe where you have strong teachers, but then you get one generation of weak teaching. And it can undo all of the strong teaching that you've had up until that point. And so what had happened in 1840, Bethany College, which still exists today, was formed by Alexander Campbell. And although this was not supported by the church, but by individuals, it did lead to error later on. Bethany College, by the way, today is still a semi-religious college. Its president, I saw online, is a woman, which is not, since it's not a church-sponsored, it's not supposed to be anyway, a church-sponsored college. That in of itself is not wrong. However, she has the title of Reverend, which I found interesting. On their website, they still say this college was founded by Alexander Campbell and the disciples of Christ. But the disciples of Christ, of course, and we'll deal with them in a few moments, is an offshoot, part of that division, and they accept a lot of things that the Bible doesn't teach. And so I just found it interesting that Bethany College right now is in West Virginia. In case you don't know, it was in this when it was founded. It was in the state of Virginia. But that's because the state of Virginia included the state of West Virginia, and the Civil War is what separated West Virginia from Virginia. West Virginia stayed up with the Union, while as Virginia did not. And so it is located in West Virginia today. And the purpose of this college was to train men to become preachers. Anyone see a problem with that? Or what could lead to a problem? Maybe not specific problem in that, but where it could lead.
Well, I guess it depends who you had teaching the young men.
Okay, that's certainly true. You get, if you have some teachers that have some doctrines that are not found in Scripture, very easy to spread false doctrine. Anything else? I would like to think of the preachers that we have in the New Testament. Preachers like Peter, and John, Timothy, Titus, Barnabas, Silas, the rest of the apostles, with the exception of Paul. What is saying about all of those men when it comes to their training to be a preacher? Did they go to official schools to do that?
No.
No, they did not. No,
They
I'm not.
didn't really have the full scriptures that we have.
No, they don't. They didn't. Now, the Apostle Paul is an example that it is not wrong to be an educated man and be a preacher.
Right.
The Apostle Paul is that example. However, we do need to be careful that these schools are not run by churches. That of course would be error in itself. But that we don't set up what would be a de facto clergy system. The congregations believe they have to have a qualified preacher in order to be, we might say a full-fledged church or a church that is operating well. This church does not need a full-time preacher to be the East End Church. The church could come along, and it might in some time in the future. This church will have a different preacher. I think we were quite fortunate that that this congregation has been able to find men at the time that they needed to fill the role, as far as to be able to be the preacher. There might come a time though when it's hard. The environment in Canada is not that conducive and enticing to a lot of American preachers. The congregation in Peterborough's not had a preacher in 3 years, almost 4 years now. They've not had a preacher because they can't find anyone willing to come up and move to Peterborough. Jordan, I don't know whether they found the preacher yet, but it's not like they had a bunch of preachers just knocking down their door either to come up here to Canada. It's, for a lot of Americans, it's a different country. Immigration laws. People are afraid of the cold in the winter if they're from the South. And so congregations need to recognize we don't have to have a preacher. It's nice to have a preacher. It might be advantageous to have a preacher. But the men here could preach every week. Bill could take 1 week, Henry another week, James another week, Jeff another week, Gord another week, and we could go all the way. You could cycle through the 9 men, or maybe the 7 men who would probably be willing to do so. And once a week, you'd have a different person speaking. Nothing wrong with that. If the men had Bible knowledge of what they were teaching. They might not have a full Bible knowledge, but at least of what they were teaching, they better know what they're teaching. And so we do that. I've tried to make sure that we did do that. We've had different people teach the class in my absence. We have different people preach even when I'm here. We have different people preach. I typically will preach 44 weeks out of the 52. I will have 2 weeks of vacation. We will have 2 gospel meetings, and then I'll usually have 2 or 3 more weeks where different ones of the men will preach on Sunday. It's a good habit to get into because this church wants elders someday, and so we do need people who are willing to teach and get practice doing it. Because if we don't have that, we're never going to have elders, because one of those qualifications is able to teach. And so you do not need formal training to be a preacher. You do not need to be ordained to be a preacher. You do not have to have formal education, a divinity degree or a theology degree or anything like that. You don't need that. In order to be a preacher of the gospel, you must be a Christian. In other words, you must be a follower of Christ according to the Bible, and have a knowledge of the Word of God, and be able to speak it. There are some people who have great knowledge of the Word of God. They get up here and they can't speak. I'm not talking about being eloquent. They just literally can't speak. They get so nervous that they're not really doing much of anything. They can't put their thoughts together. They're wandering here and there, and that's not edifying. You don't have to be an eloquent speaker, but you do have to be able to put some sentences together and some paragraphs together, thoughts together, so that the congregation can be edified by what you're preaching. 1 Timothy chapter 4, we're still there. Henry, you want to get verse 2?
Verse 2. Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine.
All right. That's what Paul told Timothy. Timothy was found in Lystra and Derbe. I forget which one, or not Lystra. It was Lystra and Derbe. But I think it was Derbe where Timothy was found. All he did was travel around with Paul. That's great experience. Great experience. And I'm sure Paul was teaching him along the way. Paul didn't open his own school, saying, all the preachers in Galatia, come to me and I'm going to formally train you so that you can be preachers. No. Paul went among the congregations, preached to them, taught them, and then there would be people who would be able to preach in that locality. And so, as such then, any male member of a congregation, where I'm 53 if you're following along, any male member of a congregation can be a preacher. Anyone. And since I've been here, I think we've had a couple who had never preached before I got here preach. And I was quite impressed with their ability to do so. When you get a little bit of a, when you get over that first sermon, sometimes it's a little bit easier to do, because you figure out it's not as scary as some people think. While many do not see anything wrong with setting up college to do this, and as done by individuals, it isn't necessarily wrong, it can lead to problems. And we see that with even the colleges that we might send our kids to, like Florida College, and a few of the other colleges that might be a little bit more liberal than that. Colleges can lead to problems. First of all, people can start looking to the colleges as the source of doctrine rather than the Bible. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, Naomi, you want to get verses 16 and 17.
All scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work.
Where does doctrine come from?
Scriptures.
Scriptures. That's where it comes from. I can see some things some of the professors at Florida College write. And while it is not wrong, I think there's some overanalyzation going on. coming up with some ideas that I don't think are true, as far as maybe when it gets into maybe some literary structure, where we read into the text far more than I think was ever intended. I was reading the other day how the book of Matthew, as far as the book of Matthew is divided into 5, you can divide it into 5 sections, and how each of those sections sort of brings to mind the 5 books, the first 5 books of the Pentateuch. And I'm sitting there going, I probably can divide the book into 6 sections or 8 sections. Like, as far as Matthew doesn't divide it that way. And so that, I think, is reading a little farther into it. Coming along and saying, well, Matthew was writing to a primarily Jewish audience in the beginning, and therefore this might be something that he would do to convince the writing style that way, I don't think would convince someone that Jesus is the Christ. That's not how John wrote. John wrote the things he wrote so that people would believe. The way he wrote them was his style, yes, but if we're looking to the style to prove the gospel, we're not going to do that often. It's the message that's going to convert people, not the literary style of Matthew. And so it's things like that, the types and antitypes. A lot of the types and antitypes we can see very clear. The Bible even speaks of them. The Sabbath, we were talking in our podcast about the physical Sabbath. Well, the physical Sabbath is a type of the spiritual Sabbath in the New Testament. Hebrews makes it very clear that there is a rest. That the Sabbath day in the Old Testament, that day of rest, typified the rest that we have in Christ. I don't have to make a guess on that. The Scriptures are very clear on it. The Aaronic priesthood of the New Testament with Christ as the high priest. Types, antitypes, we can see those. But when we start stretching things in that we say, well, this person's a type of this person's a type of that, make some great sermons, and we can make some connections. Whether or not those connections are exactly the way they were intended, that's left for other discussions. So people start looking to the colleges. If it is not taught, another problem is if it's not taught, the churches cannot support these colleges from their treasuries. Later generations might wish to do so, and I don't have to wonder if that's true. It's happened. Bethany College can be an example of that, where at times the churches were funding this. I don't see why the churches wouldn't want to fund this if it is a religious college, because people say, well, if it's right for an individual to do, it's right for the church to do. That's the argument we're going to see later. That anything an individual can do, the church can do, and that is wrong. But I can see why that comes up. The potential for error to spread is much greater. Bill already talked about this earlier. It only takes one teacher to infect an entire class with error, and it will spread like wildfire if local churches don't understand the Bible. Tammy, you want to get 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15?
And in case I'm delayed, I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth.
The church should be what stands for the truth. If we do not know the Bible, we can't stand. We just can't. We'll have no strength to stand. And so if you get a preacher coming from one of the colleges, coming to East End, say there's a vacancy, we'd like to preach. I would like to come preach here. And you say, okay, we would like to hear you preach first. Whatever he preaches on, I'm hoping it'll be a good message. But in order for the congregation to make an evaluation, they got to know what the Bible teaches, or at least have some idea. If I sit in, I've been alive for now 36 years. If I sit in a worship period and listen to someone speak, and they speak something that is so new that I had never heard it before, my radar goes off. Well, hold on a second. What gave you some new knowledge? that no one else that I had never heard of. It's not that they don't say things the same way I do. That's it. People don't say things the way Bill doesn't say things the way I do. Henry doesn't, and no one does. And I might not say things the way you would. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that is just, I've never heard of before. Chances are, if we've never heard of it, it's not in Scripture. And so, that doesn't always mean that's true, but chances are it's not. And so, we need to be able to stand for truth. And the fourth thing is it can lead to the pastor system. As churches believe they need professional preachers, sometimes not even allowing someone who is not educated to work among them. A preacher's role is to preach the gospel. It is not to oversee and lead the local church. A preacher is simply a member of the congregation. The duty of leading and overseeing the church is left to elders. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 3. We'll do 2 verses each. We'll start with Bill. Read verses 1 to 7.
This is a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach.
Not addicted to wine or flirtation, but gentle, peaceful, free from the love of money. He must be one who manages his own house well, and keeping his children under control without dignity.
For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil.
And he must have a good reputation with those outside the church, so that he will not fall into reproach and the snare of the devil.
We're not discussing the qualities of elders here, but we're talking about the type of person who is overseeing a local congregation. They need to meet these qualifications. Does every preacher meet these qualifications? No. I don't. First of all, I'm not really that old. I'm not married. I don't have children. And I might not exemplify all of these qualities to the point where an elder should. That's a lot of it. I'm young. You don't have the opportunity to excel in these. But elders should be excelling in these. And they're the ones because of their experience that should be leading the church. A preacher should not. Preachers, my dad started preaching at 22. That's awfully young to lead a congregation, and yet that's what the pastor system does. It gets a preacher to lead the congregation. Now, the denominations have come up with senior pastors, junior pastors, youth pastors, this pastor, that pastor. So they do have that going where they don't have generally a 22-year-old. But it could happen if you're in a small congregation that you have a 22-year-old. That just isn't going to work. The 22-year-old doesn't have the experience to lead a church. And they're not given that authority anyway. But this is what can happen when you set up these colleges. Again, they're not wrong in and of themselves if they are run by individuals. But they can lead to problems if we're not careful. And therefore, if we're going to be involved in that, we make sure that we're teaching what the gospel that needs to be taught. So that when individuals get involved in this, they don't think of them as just an arm of the church. That was 1840. 1849, the American Christian Missionary Society was organized. And so just as colleges began to take form, to take care of taking care of the educating of young men to be preachers, missionary societies began to be created as well in order to send these men other places. Alexander Campbell was the first president of the American Christian Missionary Society, which was an arrangement that he had earlier opposed. Alexander Campbell was getting older, and we tend to mellow as we get older. We don't have the same fight we did before. We might be willing to accept a little bit more. And he did. A missionary society is an outside organization whose work is to spread the gospel through the support of preachers. Local churches, the way this worked is local churches would agree to band together in a missionary society and pool their funds together in order to do this work. In Canada, this might look very appealing because in Ontario, there is not one church in Ontario over the regular attendance is over 75. And so when you have smaller churches, like this church has attendance in the 30s usually, around 30. And so our contributions, we spend a lot to rent this building. We spend a great portion to pay me. We do spend a fairly significant amount of money to try to spread the gospel through our podcast, through our live broadcasting, through material that we put out in the community. But you think about it. If West End and us pooled our treasuries together, even though we're going to continue being two congregations, but if we did that, we'd be able to do a lot more work. We might be able to have one preacher but support them fully. We might be able to support other preachers. If we set up a missionary society, an organization, an outside organization, sent money there, and then they can support preachers. Money goes a lot farther. And that really is a business attitude. The more localized or the more centralized you get, everyone pool. If I have $20, Naomi has $20, Bill has $20, we all have $20, and if we had to go buy a gift for somebody, we can get 3 small gifts. However, if Bill, Naomi, and me pull our $20 together, we have $60. Now we can get a bigger gift for someone if we were buying a gift. And that's sort of the idea. We could do a lot better work if we just had more money. The Missionary Society is not a collection of churches. That is going to be the sponsoring church, which will come in the 20th century. But as a result of people opposing the missionary societies. The Missionary Society was an outside organization governed by a board of directors. And the board of directors would consist of delegates from the churches that were involved in the society. So in other words, if we were involved in a missionary society, we'd probably have one delegate, be one of the members. And so there would be a headquarters someplace, and if there were 10 churches involved, they'd each have a delegate, and that would be the board of directors. This body would make the decisions as to where the money is going to be spent, and in some cases, how much needs to be donated. And these decisions would be bound on the local congregations that are involved in this missionary society. That is not the pattern we find in the Bible. In the Bible, each local church is autonomous from another local church and does its own work. It does not create outside organizations to subcontract out this work. We do our own work, which includes the support of preachers in other places. Bill, you want to give 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 8, and Henry, Philippians chapter 4, verses 14 to 18.
For the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith towards God has gone forth, so that we have no need to say anything.
Thessalonica was a very, not evangelical in the sense of the denomination, but they were an evangelizing church. They sent out people everywhere in their neighboring communities. They were very good at that. But it was the church of Thessalonica that did that. That was their work. They supported preachers. Philippians chapter 4, verses 14 to 18.
Nevertheless, you have done well to share with me in my application. You yourself also know Philippines and are the first preaching of the gospel after Macedonia. No much share with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once for my needs. Not that I seek the gift itself, but I seek it for the profit which increase to your account. But I have received everything in full and have an abundance. I'm fully supplied. Have you received from Ephesus what you have sent? A fragrant aroma and acceptable sacrifice well pleasing to God.
The pattern here, churches support directly to preachers. I am supported by 6 churches, this church and 5 others. This church does not receive a check from any other church to support me. The Canada Revenue Agency would love it if we did, because then taxes would be so much simpler. You would not have to wonder, where is this money coming from? This is money there. The government, that's a denominational structure, and that's what the government expects. But that's not how the New Testament teaches that. Money goes directly to preachers. I am doing the work of spreading the gospel here. However, other churches are partnering with me to do that. It is part of their work in spreading the gospel that I am here, teaching here. And so Paul was supported directly by the church at Philippi, and that's the only way we find the churches supported preachers in other areas. They can support the preacher among them, but supported the preacher in other areas. Elders are to oversee the congregation among them. 1 Peter 5 verse 1, the elders who are among you I exhort. I, who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. Elders are to oversee congregations, but only among them, not among other churches. There is no authority for a group of local churches to unite together under an institutional organization to do the work of the church, or to do anything for that matter. But we will see, well, like as far as the local church can send money in financial aid for those who are needy Christians. That's the only time we find a church sending money to another church. But we find that example is given because that local church will know who among them are in need, whereas the sending church does not know that. Whereas when churches support preachers, they're the ones who have decided who they're going to support. They know the need, and that preacher reports back to them as to what they are doing. And so the missionary society setup is unscriptural, should not be partaken in. Each congregation should be autonomous, separate from each other in their work. Christians might be friends with other members of congregations, but that's why there's a separate congregation. It's because a group of Christians have banded together there to do the work in their area. That's the pattern.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord,